All right. I think I am being told that we are now in our webinar. And Liz, if that is not right, let me know. But if not, I'm going to get started because I know we have an action-packed hour planned and we want to get right into it. But let me just begin, and hopefully everyone can hear me and maybe see me. But just want to say good afternoon. I think to most people, probably good morning to a few. Just really, really glad that everyone's here. I'm excited to welcome everyone to our conversation on raising resilient kids. Just very briefly, my name is Creighton Drury, and I have the honor of serving as the CEO for Partnership to End Addiction. Our mission, for those who may not know, is to help families and communities to find answers and tools in preventing and treating substance misuse and addiction, and in supporting recovery for our children and for our loved ones. This year, 2021, close to 1.5 million people are going to benefit from our free resources and services. Resources and services that are bolstered by our top-notch research, policy, and media teams. And this is important because together we're really working hard to make sure that the services we provide, the resources we provide, all of our efforts really are informed by evidence and by experience, but also that we're doing what we can to reach and engage as many people as we can in these conversations and in these efforts. It's so important that we're building partnerships. And today is one of the ways that we do that. And today is actually also a focus on a very, very critical part of our mission. You know, so much of our approach is rooted in the fact that 9 in 10 people living with substance use disorder began using before the age of 21. Something that, you know, it actually bears repeating. 9 in 10 people living with substance use disorder began using one or more substances before the age of 21. So, you know, kind of goes without saying that we know that focusing on preventing and delaying use, delaying frequency of use, or certainly intervening in frequency, especially in those teenage years, is so, so important. But it also begs the question, you know, how do we do that? You know, as a society, especially in the society that we live in, the culture that we live in, you know, how do we do that? And, you know, as we kick off today, I would just begin by sharing that, you know, my view is that the right starting question, or at least one of the right starting questions, is not asking ourselves, you know, what are the bad things, what are the negative consequences that we want to prevent from happening to our kids, but rather that one of the right starting questions is, what are the positive, healthy things we want to be promoting for our kids, and what can we do about that? And our conversation today is designed to focus on these and similar questions. We're going to hear from an absolutely spectacular all-star panel who you'll meet in a second. They're going to share their expert perspectives and the work that they focus on. We really are thrilled and privileged to have each of them joining us today. And also a big, big thanks as we get started here to my colleagues who've helped coordinate today, especially Liz Carnes, but several others. We have an absolutely fabulous team here at Partnership to End Addiction. And in case we forget to mention it, after today's conversation, please go to drugfree.org to learn more about our work and what we're doing. Let me now introduce you to our host for today's conversation. I think most of you probably know Elizabeth Vargas from her incredibly successful and award-winning career as a journalist and news anchor and a lot more. You know, I'm really also fortunate to count her as a fellow board member here at Partnership and as a friend who shares our passion for making a big, big impact, especially when it comes to taking on issues related to addiction. And so, Elizabeth, thank you for hosting us today, and let me kick it over to you.
Thank you, Creighton. It's great to be here today. And I'm not only a board member on the Partnership to End Addiction, but I'm also a parent of 2 teenage boys. And I remember back when my kids were in toddler school, believe it or not, there is such a thing in New York City. And we would have weekly parent meetings with a therapist, an expert in kids. And I loved those meetings more than anything else, really. It gave me some really concrete, good advice on how to raise my sons. And I think every parent craves that guidance and direction. And so we're really thrilled to offer that today in our seminar, our webinar, with a panel of incredible experts who know just how to do that. This has been a challenging time to be a parent, to be a kid. This pandemic has really disrupted just about every single level of life that you can think of, everything from school to friendships to social interactions. Some homes have been, turned upside down with economic insecurity. the stress of living with this pandemic. It's something I'm actually doing a whole podcast on next week, on just the sort of mental health burdens that so many people have been taking on. We know that kids have been incredibly affected by anxiety and depression during this time. We know that substance use disorder is up to record levels in this country across all demographics, but especially for young adults and teenagers. And we know that it's what causes a teenager to pick up a substance often has to do with all sorts of anxiety, depression, uncertainty, a lot of feelings that kids carry around with them and may not know how to talk about. So today is a seminar to help you help your kids, and we're so happy to have you here. Let me introduce you first of all to our panel. Starting with Dr. Linda Richter. Linda is the Vice President of Prevention Research and Analysis at the Partnership to End Addiction, where she's worked for more than 20 years conducting research on the nature, scope, predictors, and consequences of substance use and addiction, especially among young people. And as Creighton just said, it's all science-based. We're very, very proud of the research and analysis that we do at the partnership. Dr. Scott Hadland is the Chief of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine at Mass General Hospital for Children and Harvard Medical School. He's certified in general pediatrics, adolescent medicine, and addiction medicine. His work focuses on adolescent and young adult substance use disorder and prevention and treatment, and on improving care for youth and families affected, because we do know that addiction is a family disease that affects the entire family. Dr. Gaia Dowling is the Director of Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development ABCD project at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of the NIH. The ABCD study, the longest long-term study of brain development and child health in the United States, has enrolled nearly 12,000 kids aged 9 and 10, and is following them through their teens and into early adulthood to explore how diverse experiences during adolescence shape their brains, their cognitive, social, emotional, and academic developments. That's really interesting. Allison Jones leads the National Partnerships and Community Mobilization for the National Black Child Development Institute, NBCDI. It's the preeminent voice of Black children in the nation. For more than 50 years, NBCDI has been at the forefront of engaging leaders, policymakers, professionals, and parents around critical and timely issues that directly impact Black children and their families. And of course, we all know that not only have we all been dealing with the pandemic in the last year and a half, but enormous social unrest around a lot of issues regarding the George Floyd murder. I know I had a lot of very long, serious talks with my two boys about that. Dr. Benjamin Hultberg is the president and CEO of Search Institute, a nonprofit organization that studies and works to strengthen youth success in schools, coalitions, youth and family organizations, and the faith community. Dr. Hultberg is a developmental scientist, a former tenured faculty member, and experienced licensed marriage and family therapist. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here today. And Linda, I just want to start, with you, because you're the person who was the main author of this entire project. Can you tell us how you got this idea and why it's so important, especially now, even though it's probably obvious?
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone who's joined our webinar. So for 20 years, our organization had a very popular initiative called Family Day. It sought to promote simple and everyday actions that parents can take to connect with their kids in a healthy way. And it was based on our research and that of others that showed that when families regularly have meals together, kids are at lower risk of substance use and other health problems. But we soon realized that given how hard it is for some families to arrange regular sit-down family meals, the key protective ingredient wasn't really necessarily the meals themselves, but rather the act of spending routine quality time together. So the idea that time spent together in a casual way is so important is because it accomplishes a few critical things. It allows for natural opportunities for conversations about day-to-day concerns and successes between parents and their kids. It allows parents and other caregivers to model for their kids healthy attitudes and behaviors. And it ensures that parents are attuned to changes or fluctuations in their kids' emotional and physical well-being. So what we've been thinking about and pursuing more recently is the idea that parenting strategies that are so important for helping to prevent substance use are really those that could benefit kids in terms of their growth and development throughout childhood and allow them to thrive more broadly on a mental, physical, academic, and social level, not just about substance use. And we also recognize that kids who are more resilient tend to fare better when they're faced with the inevitable challenges that life throws at them. And most importantly, for this purpose, is that there are actually concrete steps and actions that parents can take to boost resilience in their kids. And as you said, Elizabeth, with all that's going on in kids' lives today, from the effects of COVID and social instability, social media effects, we really need to bolster resilience in our kids now more than ever.
It's interesting. I was reading in our literature, Linda, resilience is learned. Like any kid can learn this. I think some of us, I don't know, I had a little bit of an attitude. I have two very different sons. One of them seems to be more resilient than the other. And I always sort of assumed you're born that way. We know that grit is the number one predictor of success in life. Can grit and resilience be learned by any child?
Sure. I mean, as with any trait, there are the kind of inborn genetic factors, which I'm sure others on the panel could speak to, but everything could be enhanced or mitigated. And parents play such a critical role in modeling and fostering those positive qualities we really want to have in our kids.
Yeah, actually seeing your mom or your dad go through a tough time and be okay is an incredible thing. Like maybe parents should be less. Are you saying maybe parents should not hide that when we're going through tough times?
Great point. I mean, very often parents think they need to present this, very put together, exterior for their children, and that would be the best modeling. When in fact, the best modeling is to show that even when you have challenges or problems or setbacks, there are ways to handle it without falling apart and breaking down.
Clearly, the Partnership to End Addiction is focused on substance use disorder and preventing it or helping get treatment for families or kids or teenagers who are facing this situation. But tell me explain why we have partnered with our other panelists today and these other organizations, because substance use disorder is directly related to mental health, physical health, a lot of other things that have nothing to do, ostensibly, at least on the surface, with using drugs or alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. For most parents, especially those with younger kids, substance use and addiction are not things that they really think about until they arrive as problems on their doorstep. But while there are many helpful things that parents can do when or if that happens, waiting until that point to really have an effect on their children can sometimes be too late. So we realize there's so much more that parents can do to help prevent substance use and addiction if they start early. And in fact, when I say early, I mean from the earliest days of their children's lives. And that's using parenting strategies that affect not only substance use risk, but a range of other mental, physical, and social issues that many kids have to contend with. So to improve substance use prevention, we realize we need to look to leaders in the field of child development and learn from them about what it takes to raise resilient, healthy kids, and then incorporate that knowledge into the substance use prevention field. And the idea of not going it alone is really underscored by our organization's name, which is Partnership to End Addiction. We value partnerships in all aspects of our work, whether it's partnering with other organizations like we're doing today to achieve our mission, but really also on a different level where we emphasize the importance of partnerships between kids, parents, educators, health professionals, even policymakers to help improve the lives of kids.
Right, it takes a village, as they say.
Absolutely.
Before we get to our fabulous panel, what are the 10 parenting strategies that you just alluded to?
Well, everyone could see them up there, and I'll just say that, what we really wanted to do was draw on the recurring themes that keep coming up in our work, whether it's through our research or through our interactions with parents and other experts in the field. And although they're presented here as strategies for parents specifically, I did want to say that they actually apply across the board to all adults who are involved in a child's health and development. And they're broad and they encompass a lot, but they could be put into action in many different ways. One thing they have in common is really the idea that parents who take a health rather than a punitive approach to child rearing, who model healthy attitudes and behaviors, and who treat their children with compassion and respect are really going to increase the odds of raising resilient kids, even under the most challenging of life circumstances. So as you can see here, it's start early, don't wait to do these interventions. Be knowledgeable about what affects your kids and have credible information to share with them. Modeling health and resilience, as we keep saying, is one of the most important things parents can do. Communicating openly with your kids, sharing your expectations clearly and following through on consequences that you have agreed to with your kids, monitoring their behavior. I mean, that's a really tough one because people want to respect their children's privacy, but you must be able to monitor and know what's going on in your kid's life. Again, the health is, as opposed to a punitive approach, is so critical. We also want to encourage healthy risk taking in our kids. It's a natural part of childhood. We don't want to completely suppress them. So there are ways that they can express their emotions and their sort of sensation seeking in healthier ways, positively reinforce when they put good effort into things. And one of the most important points I'll leave you with is, if there is a problem, get help fast. Don't wait and hope for that it's going to go away.
Right. That's so
Yeah.
critical and key. All right, let's start with it. We sort of divided this up into several components: mental health, physical health, and the parent-teacher bonds. Let's start with mental health. And Ben and Gaia, I'd like you to weigh in on this. What are the risk factors? I mean, we know that we just got a question from a panelist, for example, saying, is there any kind of behavior in young children that is predictive of a possible substance use disorder later in adolescence or adulthood? I certainly have thoughts on that, but I'm not an expert panelist. I'd like to hear from our panelists on mental health, especially at a time like now, when there is so much, whether it's, because of the pandemic, whether it's the social unrest, whether it's the political vitriol that we're seeing play out, not just, in Congress, but in convenience stores and on airplane flights. What can we do? First of all, what are risk factors and what are protective factors? What can we help do to make sure that they're okay throughout all of this? Ben, why don't we start with you, and then Gaia, if you can jump in.
Sure. Well, we knew going even before the pandemic that mental health issues were on the rise for young people. We were seeing higher rates of depression and anxiety, and this is really across the different populations of young people, from those that are living in significant socioeconomic disadvantage, but also those in high achieving contexts too, that we're seeing this pressure to perform that Sonia Luther and others have noted in their research of heightened anxiety and depression. And so I think the pandemic itself perpetuated some of that, really through disconnection, through isolation, through feeling kind of apart. And I think as we think about those who are already vulnerable to mental health issues and how that was exacerbated through the pandemic and continues to be exacerbated, really one of the big anecdotes, or one of the ways to really help with mental health starts with connection, with true connection, with connection to your child, to understand what they're going through. A lot of the work that I've done previously with Amanda Sheffield Morris was really focused on this idea of emotion regulation, or the ability to manage emotions in appropriate ways, to be able to manage them in stressful environments. And what we saw in our studies even was when young kids that came into our lab that were coming from areas where they were exposed to high levels of violence, and also because of historical marginalization and racism and discrimination, had been prone to many kind of loss of opportunity. But the families were such incredible protective processes for them that literally when they're sitting in the chair and talking about what we call emotion monitoring of difficult circumstances, when the parent and the child were connected or in synchrony, we saw physiologically an impact, the ability to manage emotions better, even looking through a physiological lens. And so that connection of being able to ask the child and be connected to your child and help them with emotion related practices. And so in that work, and continue to do that work, we've seen the same type of three areas, that emotion regulation is really an important mediator of what we can influence as family members and as caring adults. And we do that through how we model how we manage our emotions. We do that through the specific practices of how we treat emotions when anger comes up. I have a 4-year-old, and just this morning getting him out the door was a huge challenge. But how I sit with with my 4-year-old and his emotion and coach him through it matters for his ability to regulate emotions. That emotion regulation is not just intrapersonal, but it's also inter. It has to do with the relationships that we're in. And then finally, the climates that you create of this kind of high responsive, high demandingness climates where you know where your child is, there's a monitoring, but there's a trust there. And so for me with mental health, I think what we see in the pandemic and see in the trends is that we're in desperate need of also these connections, of beginning to think about how we help people manage emotions and emotion regulation, and really being architects of context in that way. How can we begin to create these spaces for people that have experienced trauma in their lives and the pandemic has exacerbated, that are safe spaces, there's psychological safety, and there's absent of racism and discrimination. And so to me, I think we're at an opportune time now to start focusing on what matters. And I think that's when we, as children go back to school and all of these things are happening, to really come back to what really matters. What are those values? What really matters for what we want our children to be and become, and beginning to create the context for them to thrive.
Gaia?
Yeah, just to build on that, we know, and I think it's been talked about a little bit already, that there are so many different factors in kids' lives, and many of them we as parents don't often feel like we have control over, and a lot that's different from when we were growing up with, like you said, social media and a lot of the experiences that COVID certainly kids are going through now. And one of the reasons that the ABCD study was started was to look at that whole spectrum of influences, from genetics and early adversity to the family, to the community, to schools, because we know that they all interplay towards influencing brain development and social emotional development. And we wanted to understand, where are those opportunities for intervention to boost resilience? And one of the things that we're seeing, particularly during this pandemic period, is the impact of family conflict on mental health and substance use. Within the pandemic, what we've seen is that those families where the parents are under a lot of stress, the parents may have increased their use of alcohol, for example, and may be experiencing hardship in terms of economic loss or food insecurity. In those families, the conflict level within the household has gone up. And we know that that is associated with negative outcomes for children as well. So I think that, in terms of identifying opportunities to, help your children, it's part of the modeling that you were both speaking about, in that we want to make sure that the family unit, it's not just the interaction between the parent and child, but the family unit as a whole is in harmony, to be able to protect those kids from those adverse experiences that they may encounter.
I'm just curious what that we just got a question from, I think, from somebody asking if there was anything predictive that you can see in your child. Obviously emotional dysregulation, not having resilience, and not having a strong connective bond can contribute to a child later to turning to drugs or alcohol to self-soothe. Scott, what's the answer to that question? I mean, we do know that, addiction, there's a genetic component to this, but it's not entirely predictive. There are lots of, recovered alcoholics and addicts who have kids who never pick up a substance in their life and develop a problem, and vice versa. So what's the answer to that question?
Yeah, I take care of teens, some of whom struggle with substances, others who don't. Some of the teens I care for have very severe addiction. And when I talk to the parents about signs that they saw earlier on in life, before they started to have problems, in a lot of cases, they're modifiable issues. And so a lot of the same mental health risk factors that we've been talking about right now are identifiable much earlier in life and very intervenable, right? Like, we can make sure that young kids who are having a problem with depression or anxiety, severe ADHD, who may have a history of trauma, including physical or sexual childhood abuse, that these are sort of these are conditions that, when we get the right help and attention for kids, we do two things. One, we reduce the likelihood that they'll have downstream problems with substance use. But then two, we also know to monitor them. We just heard from Linda that what is so critical is to make sure that kids know sort of what we expect out of them, that we send the right messages, and that we monitor them. And when kids have some of these risk factors, we're able to do all of these things and sort of mobilize ourselves to be able to help them as soon as problems start to emerge. And I do want to sort of highlight a key difference that I see clinically, and that is that, yes, there are many youth who use substances sort of experimentally or recreationally with friends. And I do want to sort of like clarify that the vast majority of kids are actually not using substances, that we can send the message that most kids your age don't use substances. That's a thing that I tell my patients that I see. But it's really the kids that have these risk factors, many of which are identifiable earlier on in life, that go on to have severe problems with substances.
Risk factors meaning trauma that they've experienced, or is it also, I mean, I don't know. I have two children. One of them was born anxious and one of them wasn't. I've had anxiety since I can remember my first memory at the age of 2 or 3. So I guess what I'm trying to get really specifically from you is, what are those risk factors specifically? And by the way, there's capital T trauma that you were just talking about, and there's small t trauma. Kids can be traumatized in a lot of different ways. Just seeing something very upsetting and not being able to process that with somebody like a parent or a counselor or a teacher can lead to a traumatic feeling that can build, right?
Yeah. And that's what's so tricky about this work is that, so again, first of all, most kids that have anxiety, depression, or even that have trauma won't go on to have problems with substances. This is a risk factor, meaning that these are risk factors that predispose to having problems, but certainly by no means do they guarantee that somebody will have problems. I think what's tricky and what makes this work in some cases, more art and less science, although I think Guy and Linda will probably not like that I use that statement, is that there's a real interaction here between the young person and some of the innate qualities into which they are born, and then the world around them and the ways in which they interact with the world and the ways in which the traumas with big T's or little t's affect them. And that's why I think there's so much focus on parents and on families, because they're the first line of defense in trying to figure out when that interaction between child and world is starting to go awry.
So Elizabeth, if I could chime in here a little bit from the science side, and maybe to get to something very specific. For example, traits like risk-taking. We want our adolescents to take risks, but we want them to take healthy risks. If you can identify in your youth that they have a tendency to want to take risks, parents can channel those risks into healthy risks and maybe help, balance that what may be innate with something that could be more positive in their lives, just as a specific.
Yeah, and if I could layer onto that, I think Gaia makes a really good point. The sort of other side of risk taking is impulsivity. There are a lot of kids who sort of aren't able to keep their behavior in check as easily as other kids can, and that's another sort of risk factor. But again, it's modifiable. Parents can keep an eye out on their kids and help them navigate the world around them.
And Gaia, what are the healthy risks when you said, take those risks? But I'm thinking sports, like if you've got a kid who's a daredevil, maybe get them into skiing, or is that what you would call a healthy risk?
Yeah, exactly. Activities that can help them. I mean, we want our teens to learn through their adolescence, right? And risk taking is part of that. That's how you learn to be self-sufficient when you're on your own, is by having some freedom. COVID has made it difficult right now for engaging, with the world around them, but there are ways in safe circumstances that kids can push those boundaries to be able to learn and grow without necessarily going to the degree that could be harmful. And so making sure that there are opportunities like sports or other activities for them to push those boundaries is healthy. But we don't want it to go so far as to put them into danger that could set them on a spiral that could that could lead to really adverse consequences.
I also just have to ask all of you, and Allison, I'd like you to weigh in on this as well, if you have any thoughts. We of course have been hearing so much about Facebook and social media and the impact it's having on our kids, especially our daughters. Instagram in particular, leading to a whole, it feels like a big wave of anorexia and eating disorders because of that. Because of the pandemic and everybody being locked up and sort of, restricted to connection through their phone and their electronic devices, what are we to do as parents? I mean, I allowed my kids a lot more access on their electronics because it was the only way they could connect with anybody. And yet I'm aware that this isn't good for them. And now we're seeing the actual empirical evidence, thanks to the leakers from Facebook, how bad this is for our kids.
Yeah, I actually can jump in here. I wrote a piece for USA Today a couple of weeks ago on this very topic because I, as a pediatrician, was just so worried. Elizabeth, you just nailed it. On the front lines, we are seeing unprecedented rates of, in particular, eating disorders, but many other conditions that have a sort of tie-in to social media and many of the pressures that young people feel to attain sort of like the ideal body and sort of like the image-driven posting that we see all the time on Instagram and other social media platforms, I think has just really sort of upped the anxiety level that young people feel, and particularly feel around their own image and their own bodies. I think the revelations from Facebook have really shown us that social media can be harmful. But there are also data suggesting that social media can be helpful and can build some of these bonds and links that you've talked about, Elizabeth. And social media can also be a way that we can take some of the messaging that we as clinicians and policymakers and researchers are trying to get out to youth and to families, and use social media as a way of getting that information out there, right? So, we often hear about social media as a source of misinformation, but we also have to remember that it is a source of information for many young people, that we can get healthy messaging about substance use or avoidance of substances, healthy messaging about mental health out to young people through social media when we use it appropriately. So I do want to highlight that this could be a tool that used effectively can be very helpful. In terms of how you keep young people safe on social media, well, Linda put up the 10 principles behind raising resilient kids, and those all apply to social media, right? Set your expectations, make sure that you're monitoring, and so on and so forth.
It can be difficult to monitor, though. As a mom, I can tell you it's nearly impossible. However, we're not going to eliminate social media. And I think, again, going back to the tips that Linda put up, if you're having constant conversations, hopefully you're keeping your child grounded, right? Now let's talk about physical health. Allison, what do you see as the connection between physical health and mental health?
Hi, Elizabeth, thank you so much. And, at the National Black Child Development Institute, we have been supporting Black families through, some challenges and issues, especially in the past 20 months, quite a bit. And there is definitely a lot of connection between the two. One of the things that's really, really important for parents to be able to do and to understand is that fostering resilience in your children really requires us to kind of do a brain cleanse. And so this goes with both mental and physical health. There's been things, especially in our community, that we've heard and that we learned growing up, like don't talk, just listen. As children, we heard, do what I say, not what I do. And I think with both of these, both with mental health and physical health, we have to keep in mind to clean out all of that to produce better outcomes for our children. In the mental health space, it's important for us to remember that it's okay to be strong, but it's also really important to listen and acknowledge children's feelings. It's important to encourage them with your words, right? This is a time in their lives, especially when they're young, very young, that their brain development is happening, and so much social emotional connections are happening at that time, right? And so boosting that resilience by encouraging them and talking to them and listening to their feelings, and there's respect that comes with that. And then also, for the physical piece, it's kind of the same thing. It's also kind of cleaning out what we have heard that may not have been healthy, and beginning to have some new practices and to start a new movement. You know, community is important to people. And so the pandemic isolated a lot of folks, especially people in disenfranchised communities. And so people being able to connect with others was part of the way that kids were able to get their exercise and get out and get moving. And so when that wasn't happening, there was kind of this wave of, let's just focus on our electronic devices. And so again, I think it's just really important for us to, you know, make sure that as we're fostering all these great things in the mental health space with our children, that we also begin to exude and show behaviors in the physical health space. You know, mom is getting up and exercising. Mom is, you know, taking a couple of walks around the block and bringing our children along with us. I think it's important for us to consider this a movement and not consider this just, you know, something that is taught and talked about on platforms like this. But this is something this is a behavior. This is a new behavior that we're adopting, and that will continue way beyond just a conversation. It will be something that is infused into the culture of our families. The importance of being able to talk, encouraging your children with your words, but also showing them really healthy physical health practices. And something that I think is really important, and it should be a component of any health and nutrition program that we at NBCDI would love to see, is for these programs to improve the outcomes for young children of color by providing strength-based resources that reflect our children's families, cultures, and communities. And an example of this in the physical health space would be, you know, including healthy ways to cook a soul food dish, right, in your nutrition guide or in the recipe book, and really infusing cultural awareness and celebration so that people feel connected to, okay, I can eat a healthy meal. And so instead of putting lard in my collard greens, I'm going to use olive oil to start them off and cook them. Like, so just really infusing that cultural awareness and celebration to really help and encourage parents to participate in these kinds of activities and encourage them to develop new practices and new ways of doing things that are healthier for their families and have better outcomes for their children.
Yeah, you said so many really important things just now, Allison. First of all, I wanted to just, you know, I'm sure when in encouraging your child to share his or her feelings, I would imagine it's also important not to judge those feelings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, again,
say it.
Yeah, culturally, this is something that a lot of our families, not all, but a lot of our families were just taught, nope, you listen, you be quiet. You know, as a child, you don't talk back. You know, as a matter of fact, that's a negative connotation. You say talk back, that's a problem. Don't talk back. You listen and that's it. And so these are just things that we have to kind of clean out and begin to practice differently. And it's okay.
And I know that people might look at physical health and think, oh, you know, this has nothing to do with mental health. It actually really does. Think about those of us who've ever had a toddler. When they're tired, the world is a terrible place. You know, when I'm tired, the world is a terrible place. So that link between how you feel physically and how you feel mentally, I would imagine is incredibly important. So I know it doesn't sound like it's an important thing to take care of when you're talking about taking care of your mental health and developing resilience, but it actually is. If you are well rested, if you have gotten enough to eat and it's made, your collard greens are made with olive oil and not with lard, and you've been outside to get some exercise, the world looks a lot less bleak. I mean, wouldn't you all agree that there's a huge connection, mind, body? I mean,
Yes.
there have been books out there for years about this.
Yeah, I'll even just say that the sleep example you gave is a great one, because there is a whole body of research that directly links poor sleep habits or insufficient sleep to kids' risk on multiple levels, including substance use risk. So there's a real connection right there.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of links between both like sports involvement, team sports. There's so much there that is beneficial, and links to participation leading to lower risk of depression. And with the sleep, you also see that there's a cycle that forms. If there's bad sleep, then you see more depressive symptoms, which leads to poorer sleep, and kids can get in a cycle. So absolutely, there's a link between physical health and mental health.
I've always told my kids that sports are a great metaphor for life. You learn teamwork and discipline. And this is when I wanted to move on to the parent-child bonds. Another really important thing to teach our young children and even our teenagers, I would think, is something, it's delayed gratification. In other words, isn't that an important component of developing grit and resilience, is learning how to wait and not have that immediate gratification, which I think could also then lead to impulsivity, right? Any one of you guys can jump in on that, unless I'm totally off the mark.
Well, I think one important point you raised there is sometimes parents who are under a lot of stress or time constraints, so they sort of do what's expedient, and for good reason. So if a kid's nagging, I want this, I want that, 10 more minutes on screen time, I want to eat this unhealthy food, sometimes it is easier and understandable to say, okay, fine. And then you kind of give in, and that sort of feeds into this, I want something, I get it right away. And it's no fault of the parents, it's just like how life is. There's also this dynamic sometimes where parents are sort of afraid of their kids. Like if they kind of say no too much, that's going to damage their bond with their child. The child's going to hate them, not tell them things, not allow them insight into their lives. And the truth is that, again, it goes back to this modeling thing, where if you can sort of show your kids that, hey, it's okay, you could wait a second, we're going to get to that. There are various priorities within our family, and it's the family unit, and it's not just the individual's needs that are so important. That just kind of sends so many important messages to the kids. Like, we all have to care for each other. I'm doing something right now, but I'm certainly going to turn to it as soon as I can and help you. Maybe take a break for a few minutes. These are all in this one instance of, hey, I want that candy right now. Parents have like 10 opportunities to kind of teach lessons to their child that they want them to take away for other purposes as well.
I just think in today's world, especially we were talking about social media, where everything is instant, how many likes did I get? How many dislikes did I get? It's very instant gratification. And it just feels like, to me, sometimes it can feed something that's unhealthy in our kids emotionally.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, I want to highlight that this is very different from when, I don't want to lump us all into the same age category, just to declare I'm about to turn 40. But when we were growing up, the images that you saw that you idealized were often sort of in magazines or on TV, and there's a bit of a distance there, right? What's different now, to be very clear, is that with social media, when you are making those comparisons between what others may have and what you don't, you're actually looking at your peers. Or if you're not looking at your peers, you're looking at people that could be your peers that you don't know. Maybe you just know them because you follow them on social media. And that's a different sort of connection that is that feeds into this sort of instant gratification. And we're all still grappling with this.
Well, because, by the way, as somebody in recovery, it's the instant gratification that leads you down that slippery slope. I don't want to do the longer, more subtle, gradual work to feel better. I want the quick fix, to take the edge off. You know what I mean? Like, I think I'm just saying that we've had several people weigh in with questions of what are the predictive factors for substance use disorder later in life. And one of them is learning to sit in discomfort, to talk to somebody about that discomfort and share it, and to understand that sometimes the only way out is through. You got to feel a little crappy for a little while, but it'll get better, right?
Yeah, and at the outset of this talk, Creighton really highlighted the extent to which among all people who have problems with substances, people with substance use disorders, 9 out of 10 of them started during adolescence. And it's no surprise, because during these adolescent years is when you're supposed to be developing healthy coping skills. You're supposed to know how to sit with that discomfort or cope with it in the right ways. Go for a walk, talk to a friend about it, talk to a parent about it, rather than turning to substances. And so it's often not a surprise that in my own practice, I'll be caring for a 25-year-old who's been using substances for a decade, and they still haven't quite figured out how to sit with that discomfort. They haven't figured out how to cope when problems come up.
So other panelists, how do we help our kids do that? How do we teach our kids that very important life skill of life isn't always going to feel great? We want to make everything, great for our children, but sometimes the most important thing we can teach our kids is that sometimes it's not great. Sometimes it's not fair. Sometimes it feels really downright awful. So how do we give them that, distress tolerance? Teach them that.
One of the things that I immediately thought about was we have an affiliate in Detroit, Michigan, and our affiliates are basically part of our network, and they're the ones that work directly with parents. And we have a family empowerment program. And one of the things that that I've heard from this affiliate is that, a lot of times parents will say, oh, but I didn't let my child know that I was upset in that moment, or I didn't let my child know that I was stressed out in that moment. And of course, being careful with the language that we use, I think it's really important to be honest with children and let them know when you are experiencing a challenge, and let them see how you're dealing with that, hopefully in a healthy way. And as we're developing, because I know this topic is the parent-child bond, and as you're developing that bond with your children, there are some really simple things that I think parents just have to remember and keep in mind, like creating rituals and having, what you do at night, whether it's read the book after the bath, sing a song, and then you go to bed. Having those rituals is super important for them. Eating meals together, being available distraction free. All of us have access to our phones, and I've done it before. I've been guilty of checking my email from my phone. And, my daughter will say, Mommy, hold on, I'm right here. I want to have a conversation with you, So being able to be distraction free, and also saying things like, I love you often. Like, all of these things will really promote that relationship and that bond that you have with your child, and produce resilience in them. So all our very educated researchers here can say that, all of those things contribute to their resilience. And so, really being able to listen again and empathize with them, of course, still setting boundaries and rules, but all of those things put together, that is what really produces a resilient child.
If I could just throw in one comment based on something I just saw come up in the chat, which is inject some humor. It all is so serious and heavy, but that's a great thing to model for your kids too. So I don't mean make fun of your children ever in any way, but make fun of yourself, make fun of the situation. Just try to lighten things up sometimes when they seem very heavy without being dismissive of your children's feelings. Kids want to laugh, they want to be relaxed, they do not want the stress in the home. And whatever can happen to make that, more likely is really important, while also paying attention to the fact that kids are kind of witnessing and seeing everything that goes on in the household, even if you're not directly involving them. So that relates to, how you interact with the other people in your life as an adult, whether it's your partner, your own parents, siblings, etc. That's all modeling for your children, like how to interrelate with people and how to kind of take on life's challenges.
Right. I don't think it works to say to your child, it'll all be okay, while you're walking around stressed and you're modeling one thing and you're sort of minimizing. Let them talk about it. Get it out, hear what they have to say, empathize, sympathize, and then it's not the end of the world. I think,
Right.
I think
don't catastrophize. Exactly.
Yeah. The only thing anybody ever really wants is for someone to tell them it'll all be okay, but only after really hearing and synthesizing what's going on. So, and I'm just curious, Benjamin, if you could weigh in on this. We have, obviously a lot of families are divorced and kids are bouncing back, sometimes back and forth between two homes. How can you that has got to be stressful. I'm a divorced parent. I'm very aware of the stress that my kids must go through going back and forth, and how careful I need to be about what I say and how I think, because they can see it all over my face. Do you have any advice for families who find themselves in that situation on how to navigate those very tricky waters?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the first thing I would say, and I think it's important to say, is that, when we think about resilience, it's multiple systems across our communities that impact resilience. Resilience is not an individual trait. It's not an individual thing that you have or you don't have. And so I think the part of when we think about like divorce, for example, the research is pretty clear that actually with divorce, it depends on the age of the kid when the divorce happens. That's impactful, but it also is the level of conflict that's in the home, and then how well the parents can co-parent after that. So if it's actually decreased the amount of conflict between parents when the separation happens in the long run, that could be a good thing for that child. And so I think part of it is for parents, first of all, I mean, one of the best concepts in parenting that I think stuck out to me after I had kids is this idea of good enough parenting. And I think that this is important because sometimes as parents, we can blame a lot on ourselves. We can think that it's all that if we don't do it perfectly, then our kids are going to struggle or be in pain. But really what we have to be is good enough, that we provide that the two basic needs are, am I worthy? That comes from love, and love recognizes the worthiness and value of, as Allison said, of the child. And am I safe? And that's trustworthiness. And every child is born with those and is entitled, by the way, to those innate needs, is that we provide that love that says, I see you, I know you, you're worthy. And then also as I'm safe and it's predictable, I know what to expect. And so for parents who are co-parenting, or when we think about this, it's providing predictability within the home so the child knows what to expect. They know that when they walk into mom's home, or mom and mom, whoever's the parent is, there's an expectation that I know what to expect. It's predictable, it's understandable, and there's not making your child pick split loyalties, and really understanding that at the end of the day, the goal is to raise your child. Even if you disagree, you raise your child in a way that allows them to experience love and trustworthiness. And I think that's really a critical piece.
Let's move now to school and community engagement, because I know we're running out of time, but this is crucial too. I mean, most kids spend 8 hours a day at school. Not with me, they're with teachers that I'm trusting and hoping are looking out for them and will tell me if they see something that's upsetting or that needs addressing. What can we do? I know we had a comment about this already. A lot of kids are feeling pressure, not from parents, but from themselves in school to do well. And that's, we even before the pandemic, we were seeing stress and anxiety and even depression really escalating for our kids. How can we counteract that? We still want them to do their best, but what if their best, looks like a C and they're feeling incredibly stressed out about that? And how do we make sure that that school component and community component is working well? Any one of you can jump in.
I mean, I'll just say, this is an area that we focus on at Search Institute often is how do we help schools and communities also create these relationship-rich organizations, and really thinking about the relational climate in which your kid is in school is really important. And we talk about developmental relationships as having these 5 elements that you can see on the website. But I think what's important about that is that when we create these contexts of performance for young people, especially different ages, but adolescents that are really prone to creating ideals, social comparisons, and these are heightened at this time, and the emotional reactivity is heightened at this time, that we have to understand how are we helping them motivate to get a sense of this motivation that is internal, that is about what's important to them and what sparks them. And once you find that spark with young people, how do we help foster it? I think we often think we have to put things into young people instead of also create the circumstances to draw it out of what's already in them. And that adolescents in particular are incredible. They can come up with their own solutions when we share power in the classroom, when we allow for the thinking, the the kind of thinking that allows them to think of solutions of their own, of how they create in the classroom. And so when we think of the school and community, for me, there's a couple things I would be looking for is how are they providing that support to my child? Sports came up. I've studied sports a lot throughout my life. I'll tell you, sports is a good indicator of several positive outcomes, but it also can lead to more negative outcomes like substance abuse, depending on the context of the sport. And when the pressure to perform, when my worth and value as a human being gets based on my performance, that has all kinds of negative consequences for young people. But if I can help draw out the best in them, and the motivation comes from something different, a foundation of health, that's a very different experience of learning about teamwork and self-control and all of these things. So the motivation behind it really matters, and how a school and a community engages in that, whether it's after school and sports or the pressure to perform, it becomes really important for us to talk about with our young people of what their expectations are for themselves and what does success mean, what is thriving. Otherwise, we just get to results-based, achievement-based identities that become negative over time.
Right, but that am I good enough can be measured by anything. Do I get an A or a C? Am I a starter on the basketball team, or I'm a bench warmer? I don't know. I'd like the rest of the panel to weigh in very quickly before we get to our closing remarks. But I'm just curious. It's we just tell our kids, just do your best, work hard and do your best, and then it's out of your control.
Yeah, I will weigh in. And it's interesting to me because in addition to all of these things that, some students are thinking about right now, there's also a lot that's still existing and that's lingering because of what's been happening the past 18 to 20 months. And so, especially in the Black community, Black children, they've been exposed to stressors that some adults have never even had to experience, right? So just really quickly, I'll share that, seeing somebody that looks like your dad or your uncle being murdered on television, or images of people that look like you being shot in their neighborhood taking a jog, those kinds of things have really taken a toll on our children. I have a son that's 13, and it seemed like, for the last couple of weeks, all of his papers have been about police shootings or, what's going on with COVID. And so, on top of all of these things that were happening in the space of social unrest, we've got all the COVID-19 pandemic stuff that was happening in the Black community. So the cases, the hospitalizations, the death, they were all disproportionately Black. And my son watches the news, right? So he knows these things and he hears these things. He's a straight A student, so he also reads. And so due to structural inequities and social determinants of health that were all influenced, by implicit bias and racial discrimination, these things were all existing. And so, for him to be learning about that and at the same time kind of experiencing, is grandma okay? Grandma's sick. There are all these different stressors in addition to the performing, right? And doing well in school. And so that's a lot. And I think it's really important for us to be able to say, in this climate and in our current situation, are you okay? What's going on? How are you decompressing? Do you have a way to relax? Are you playing and being a kid? Or are you just thinking about these things? And so it's really important to pay attention to those things in addition to, of course, they want to achieve, of course, they want to do well in school. But there are just groups of children that have a lot of other stressors in addition to that. And we have to pay attention to those things and make sure that they have the support in place to deal with all of that.
I
Wow,
know we're almost out of time, but I would just like to say one more thing on the community engagement, particularly with respect to what Allison was just saying, which is one of the things that we also looked at is participation in Black Lives Matter protests and how Black youth really felt empowered by that. And so that sort of community engagement can also help in deal with these tough circumstances that kids are seeing.
right, being actually doing something about this incredibly enormous situation. Thank you, panelists, so much. I think that I loved the fact that somebody said every child deserves to feel worthy and to feel safe. So everything that we can do as parents to help them feel those two things, to be basically an enlightened witness who's putting up some guardrails. and some really good advice on just having some conversations. It's not big stuff, it's small stuff, but whatever we can do, let our kids see our own struggle and that we get through it will help them build their own grit and resilience. So thank you so much to our panel. Our kids, our world is going through so much right now. We cannot underestimate the impact that all this is having. To learn more about raising resilient kids, including downloading the guide and viewing a recording of this webinar, you can visit drugfree.org/resilient-kids. You can explore drugfree.org to learn all about the resources offered by the partnership, including a helpline for parents facing a loved one's substance use. Help and Hope by Text, online support community, and more is available there. And our thanks to our partners on this, the ABCD study at the National Institutes of Health, Collaborative for Social and Emotional Learning, Common Sense Media, Search Institute, National Black Child Development Institute, Inseparable Hopeful Futures Campaign, Child Mind Institute, and Mass General Hospital for Children's Dr. Hadlin. Thank you so much, all of us, for being with us. And to stay in the loop and see more events, visit our website. Thank you so much. Have a great
Thanks,
day.
Elizabeth. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thanks.